Evidences that Jesus was black. For centuries, Jesus has been painted as an European with pale skin, light hair, and blue eyes. But indeed, history, scripture, and science all suggest a very different image. An image of Jesus as a black man. In this video, we're not talking church tradition. We're dealing with history. By the end of this video, you'll understand why so many scholars, historians, and theologians are revisiting the question, was Jesus black? Let's start with this simple fact. Jesus was born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, in the region we now call the Middle East. This land sits at the crossroads of Africa and Asia, a melting pot of African, Semitic, and Mediterranean peoples. Egypt, just a few days' journey away from Judea, was the dominant cultural and political power for centuries. Caravans, trade routes, and migrations constantly linked Judea with Africa. So if we simply ask, what did people in this region look like? The answer is clear. They were dark-skinned, Afro-Asiatic peoples, with features very different from the blonde-haired, fair-skinned portrayals we see in European art. This means Jesus was a man of color, closer in appearance to today's black populations than to the pale European portraits we've inherited. The Bible itself gives us surprising clues about Jesus' appearance. In the book of Revelation, Jesus is described as having hair like wool and feet the color of burnished bronze, a striking image that resonates more with African features than with European ones. The prophet Daniel also described a vision of a messianic figure with skin like polished bronze. What is striking is that nowhere in Scripture was Jesus described as pale-skinned, blue-eyed, or European-looking. Those features only appeared later in medieval European art, when churches and empires deliberately reshaped Jesus' image to reflect their own likeness. In other words, the biblical record itself aligns far more with a man of African or Afro-Asiatic descent than with a whitewashed image we've been given for centuries. Now, one of the most overlooked episodes in the Bible is when Mary and Joseph fled with the infant Jesus into Egypt to escape King Herod's massacre. Pause and think about this. Why would they flee to Egypt of all places? Was it because in Egypt they could blend in and disappear among the local population without standing out? That only makes sense if Mary, Joseph, and the young Jesus looked like Egyptians, dark-skinned African people. If Jesus had been light-skinned and European-looking, he would have been immediately noticeable in Egypt. But the fact that they chose Egypt and that they successfully hid there for years is itself strong evidence that Jesus looked like the native black population of Africa. This single fact is one of the clearest indications that Jesus was not European. He was a man whose family could vanish safely in Africa. Another critical piece of evidence comes from understanding who the ancient Jews were. Modern images of Jews are often shaped by centuries of European history, but the Jews of Jesus' time were Semitic people, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, living in the hot climate of the Middle East. Archaeological records and genetic studies confirm that these populations were darker-skinned, resembling modern Afro-Asiatic groups. Ancient Israel was never isolated. It was constantly influenced by African nations, from Egypt to Ethiopia. Marriages, migrations, and cultural exchanges blurred any rigid racial lines. So when we picture Jesus as a Jew of the first century, we must place him in this historical reality. A Semitic man, likely dark-skinned, with features that would align far more with African and Middle Eastern peoples than with Europeans. To imagine otherwise is to erase his roots and rewrite history. The early spread of Christianity also reveals its African connections. Within few decades of Jesus' death, the faith took root in Africa. Egypt became a center of Christian scholarship, while Ethiopia adopted Christianity as a state religion long before most of Europe did. Why is this important? Because Africans recognized something of themselves in the story of Jesus. He was not a foreign European figure imposed upon them. He was kin, one of their own. The Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in the book of Acts is one of the earliest recorded Christian converts. African bishops like Athanasius of Alexandria shaped Christian doctrine centuries before Rome dominated the faith. This deep African involvement makes sense only if Jesus and his earliest followers were people of color, whose message resonated naturally across African societies. The white Jesus we see in paintings would not appear until Christianity became tied to European empires hundreds of years later. So, if the evidence points toward a black Jesus, how did we end up with the European version? The answer lies in power and politics. When Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, images of Jesus began to shift. Artists in Europe painted him to look like themselves, white, regal, draped in imperial robes. This image reinforced European dominance and justified colonialism centuries later, portraying Europe as the natural guardian of Christianity. During the Renaissance, painters like Michelangelo cemented this image with the iconic blue-eyed, fair-skinned Jesus. But remember, these were works of art, not history. They reflected the artist's world, not the real Jesus. This deliberate whitewashing erased his African and Semitic roots, replacing them with a sanitized European ideal that served empire, not truth. Some people may ask, does it really matter what Jesus looked like? The answer is yes, because representation matters. For centuries, the whitewashed Jesus has been used to promote systems of oppression, slavery, and colonialism. He was weaponized as a symbol of European superiority. But when we recover the historical truth that Jesus was a man of color, rooted in Africa and the Middle East, we not only correct history, we restore dignity to communities who were told they could never see themselves in God. A black Jesus is not just about skin tone. It's about recognizing that divinity and holiness are not bound to whiteness. It's about dismantling centuries of false imagery and reclaiming a faith that was always global, diverse, and rooted in the struggle of oppressed people. In short, reimagining Jesus as black is not revisionist history. It's a return to history, to truth, and to justice. Asterisk. So now the question is yours. Do you prefer a black or white Jesus? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, share it with someone who still believes in the white Jesus.